Blake Dawson, 35, lived a quiet and predictable life in a small snowy town in Nebraska, where the wind whispered through the pine trees and everyone greeted each other by name. Every morning before sunrise, he walked to the local supermarket where he spent hours stocking shelves, pushing carts, and helping customers find whatever they needed. His co-workers admired his gentle nature and soft-spoken voice, even though exhaustion often weighed down his shoulders. Yet Blake never complained. He believed that peace came not from wealth or status, but from returning each night to the little wooden house he shared with his wife, Alina, and their 2-year-old daughter, Grace. For a long time, Blake thought love was simple: quiet dinners, warm hugs, and small dreams shared between two hearts. But lately, the warmth in his home had begun to fade. Alina, 30, had once adored Blake's steady nature, telling him she loved the calm he brought into her life. But now she barely looked at him. She worked at Orion Energy, one of the biggest companies in the state, and Blake had watched her hunger for ambition grow like a wildfire. Her dreams now stretched far beyond their little town. She wanted luxury, travel, excitement, things Blake felt he could never give her. "Alina, is everything okay between us?" he asked one evening as she hurried past him with her phone pressed to her ear. She forced a smile, brittle and thin. "Of course, Blake. Don't overthink," she murmured before disappearing into the bedroom. Her voice sounded like a door closing. Blake felt something cold seep into his chest. Little Grace, blissfully unaware, scribbled on the walls in crayon, shouting "Daddy" whenever he entered the room. Blake lived for her laughter. He didn't need much, just them. But he didn't know his quiet world was already cracking beneath him. One cold afternoon, Blake drove past the towering Orion Energy building on his way home. Snow drifted down like feathers, painting the world in soft white. His mind was tired, and he wanted nothing more than to get home and lift Grace into his arms. But then he saw something that made the steering wheel slip slightly beneath his fingers. Alina stepped out of the building wearing a tight navy blue dress he had never seen before, her hair glowing under the winter sun. She didn't walk toward the bus stop or the employee lot. No, she headed straight for a sleek black Mercedes parked at the curb. The driver's door opened, and a confident young man stepped out. Frost Dawson, the CEO of Orion Energy. Blake froze at the intersection as he watched them exchange warm smiles, a smile Alina hadn't given him in months. Frost leaned in, whispered something in her ear, and Alina laughed softly before slipping into the passenger seat. Blake felt something inside him crack sharply, like ice breaking under pressure. "Maybe it's work," he whispered to himself. "Maybe it's nothing." But the days that followed tore apart that fragile hope. Alina became someone he barely recognized, taking calls in the hallway, whispering and giggling at midnight, coming home smelling of expensive perfume, offering excuses that sounded practiced and hollow. One night Blake tried again. "Alina, are you happy here?" She didn't even look up from her phone. "I'm fine, Blake," she said flatly. "Stop asking." He lay awake beside her, listening to the silence between them, wondering when his wife had become a stranger. And deep inside, he felt the unmistakable truth. He was losing her. 2 weeks before Christmas, Blake finally saw what he had been too afraid to face. The night was rainy, the streets shining like black glass beneath streetlights, when he drove past the Grand Maple Hotel. Something tugged at his instincts, urging him to slow down. Under the golden awning, he spotted the same black Mercedes. His breath caught. He watched as Frost Dawson stepped out first, then moments later Alina followed. Her hair was messy, cheeks flushed, and she looked free in a way she never looked at home. Frost leaned close and whispered something that made her laugh, then gently pulled her in for a soft kiss under the warm glow of the entrance lights. Blake's heart shattered so loudly he could almost hear it echo inside the car. He drove home in silence, numb, the rain sounding like a heartbeat he no longer trusted. Little Grace was asleep on the floor, crayons scattered beside her. Blake knelt beside her drawings, tears welling in his eyes. When Alina came home hours later, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his, Blake stood up sharply. Were you with Frost? He asked, voice trembling. Alina froze, then rolled her eyes. Blake, don't start, she muttered. He stepped closer. What about our marriage? What about Grace? Her expression hardened into cold stone. I don't love you anymore, she said calmly, as if reading a weather report. And I don't want this life. Or this town. Or. She hesitated. Grace either. Blake felt his knees buckle. You're a supermarket clerk, she added with a cruel smile. Frost shows me what real life looks like. And in that moment, Blake realized she had left him long before she walked out the door. 2 days before Christmas, Alina packed her bags while Blake stood helplessly in the doorway. She didn't hug Grace. She didn't whisper goodbye. She didn't even look at her daughter, who kept calling Mama from her crib. Alina placed her wedding ring on the kitchen table beside a stack of divorce papers and walked out without a second glance. Hours later, Blake's phone buzzed with a flight confirmation. Alina Dawson, Houston to Paris. Blake sat down heavily, pulling Grace into his arms as snow fell softly outside. We'll be okay, somehow, he whispered, though he didn't believe it. Christmas night was painfully silent. Neighbors celebrated next door, music humming through the thin walls. Blake sat in the dim living room with Grace sleeping against his chest, feeling like the loneliest man alive. Then 3 soft knocks on the door. Blake froze. No one visited him at that hour. He opened the door cautiously and gasped. A tall, silver-haired man stood there wearing a long winter coat. His eyes were sharp yet trembling with emotion. Blake Dawson? The man asked gently. I've been searching for you for 35 years. Blake blinked in confusion. I think you have the wrong house, he stammered. But the stranger shook his head slowly. No. You are my son. Blake felt the world tilt. Sir, that's impossible. The man's voice softened. My name is Richard Dawson, chairman of Dawson Industries. And your biological father. Blake staggered backward as the man removed his coat and stepped inside. He spoke of Blake's mother, Anna, how she died giving birth to him, how he raised Blake alone until the boy vanished at age 2. When he placed a faded baby photograph on the table, Blake felt his breath leave his body. The hazel eyes staring back were his own. Blake's mind spun as Richard placed a second document on the table, a DNA test showing a 99% match. His legs felt weak. Grace shifted in his arms, sensing the tension. Blake whispered shakily, No. My parents, Jonathan and Jade, they would never lie to me. But memories flickered in his mind like broken film, unanswered questions, missing baby photos, vague childhood stories. Richard's voice was gentle. They were paid, but I never stopped looking for you. Blake stood abruptly, pacing the room. Why now? Why Christmas? Richard's answer was soft but chilling. Because my younger son, your half-brother Frost, has crossed too many lines. He is dangerous. And when my investigators traced Alina, they found you. Blake froze, his heart pounding. Frost Dawson, the man who stole his wife, was his own brother. The truth burned through him like fire and ice. The next morning, still shaking, Blake made a decision that would change everything. He called Richard and whispered, Come with me. I need answers. They drove to the small wooden house where Blake had been raised. Jonathan and Jade sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee when Blake entered with Richard behind him. Their faces drained of color instantly. Mom. Dad, am I really your son? Blake asked, voice trembling. Jonathan slammed his fist on the table. Who told you such nonsense? Richard calmly placed the DNA test and baby photo on the table. Tell him, he said coldly. Jade broke into sobs. Jonathan's shoulders slumped. Fine, he whispered. We were paid. We didn't know what we were getting into. Blake collapsed into a chair, the world spinning. Without a word, he walked out into the freezing morning air. Richard followed, placing his coat over Blake's shoulders. You didn't deserve this life, he whispered. Blake wiped his tears. What do I do now? Richard answered softly. Let me protect you. Let me protect Grace. You're not alone anymore. In the days that followed, Richard visited Blake often, not as a powerful chairman, but as a father trying to rebuild 35 stolen years. He brought warm meals, blankets, small gifts for Grace, and a quiet presence Blake didn't know he needed. Grace adored him instantly. She climbed onto his lap as if she'd known him forever, giggling as Richard pretended to lose at peekaboo. Blake watched them from across the room, torn between grief and gratitude. One snowy afternoon, while Richard and Grace stacked wooden blocks on the carpet, the front door suddenly swung open. Blake jumped to his feet, nearly knocking over a mug of coffee. Standing in the doorway was Alina, her expression sharp, impatient. And beside her stood Frost Dawson. Blake felt his stomach flip violently. Grace whispered, "Mama," from behind him, but Alina didn't even look at her. Frost's eyes darted to Richard. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he demanded, voice tense. Alina's face paled. "Mr. Dawson, I didn't know you were here." Blake stepped forward, fury rising in his chest. "How dare you walk into my home with him?" he snapped. "Grace is right here." Alina crossed her arms. "Don't be dramatic, Blake. I just came for my things." Frost smirked arrogantly. "She made the right choice leaving you," he said. "You're nothing but a nobody." Blake's fists clenched at his sides. Before he could speak, Richard rose slowly from the carpet, towering over both of them. His voice thundered across the room like a storm breaking open. "Enough," he commanded. The room fell silent instantly. Frost stiffened. Alina stepped back in fear. Richard pointed at Blake. "He is my eldest son." Frost's mouth fell open. "What?" And just like that, the entire world shifted again. "You're lying," Frost shouted, trembling with rage. "He is not my brother." Richard didn't budge. His voice was calm but carried the weight of unshakable truth. "DNA does not lie, Frost." Blake stood frozen, Grace gripping his leg as if sensing the danger in the room. Alina stared at Blake, horror dawning in her eyes. She whispered, "Blake, you're a Dawson." Blake swallowed hard but didn't answer. Frost suddenly kicked a chair across the room. It slammed into the wall, making Grace scream. Blake scooped her into his arms instantly. "Stop this!" Blake yelled. Richard stepped forward. "Frost, listen to me," he said firmly. "You were a child when this happened. You didn't know. But your mother orchestrated the kidnapping." Frost stared at him, color draining from his face. "No," he whispered. "She would never." "She did," Richard said. "She stole Blake so you would remain the only heir." Frost's breathing turned shallow. Alina backed toward the door, clearly frightened. Blake whispered quietly, "I never wanted your life, Frost. I just wanted my family." Those words cut deeper than any accusation. Frost turned away, eyes blazing with humiliation and heartbreak. He stormed toward the exit, grabbing Alina's wrist. "We're leaving," he growled. Alina didn't protest. The door slammed behind them so hard the picture frames rattled along the wall. Grace sobbed into Blake's shoulder. Richard placed a trembling hand on Blake's arm. "They will try to ruin you now," he warned softly. Frost was raised believing he was the only Dawson heir. "He won't accept this easily." Blake nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I just want peace for Grace." Richard exhaled deeply. "Sometimes, Blake, peace requires standing up, not stepping back." The next morning, Richard's warning proved painfully true. Rumors exploded across social media and news outlets. Headlines spread like wildfire. "Blake Dawson, fraud." "Supermarket clerk claims Dawson bloodline. Possible inheritance scam?" Reporters camped outside Blake's apartment, shouting questions whenever he stepped outside to buy milk or diapers for Grace. "Blake, did you fake the DNA test? Are you after the Dawson fortune? Did you kidnap your own child?" Grace clung to him, terrified of the flashing cameras. Inside the supermarket, co-workers whispered behind shelves. "He just wants money," one muttered. Blake lowered his head and pushed carts silently, pretending not to hear. But every rumor sliced deeper than the last. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with his hands buried in his hair. "How do I fight all this?" he whispered to no one. Richard entered without knocking, his expression sharp and determined. "You're not fighting alone," he said. Before Blake could respond, Richard set up his phone and began recording a public statement right there in the living room. His voice was steady. "My name is Richard Dawson," he said, "and Blake Dawson is my biological son. He was kidnapped at age 2. I have proof." Within minutes, the video went viral. News stations replayed the footage non-stop. Richard held up the DNA test, the old photo, and even the original police report filed 35 years ago. Comments flooded in. "Poor man, he suffered so much. The truth always comes out." Public sympathy shifted instantly in Blake's favor. But Frost retaliated just as quickly. The next morning, he released edited footage of Blake and Alina arguing years earlier, twisting it to make Blake look violent. "See," Frost said in a televised interview. "He's unstable. He's dangerous. He wants money." Blake felt sick. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This ends now," he growled. Richard launched a full internal audit of Dawson Industries and summoned every relative to the Grand Dawson mansion for a private meeting. "You're coming with me," he told Blake firmly. "They need to hear the truth from you and from me." The mansion glowed like ivory in the winter sunlight, towering over a vast garden lined with frozen fountains. Blake felt small walking through the enormous double doors, holding Grace tightly against his chest. Dozens of family members stood in the marble hall, whispering behind champagne flutes as he entered. Some stared with open curiosity, others with doubt. Frost was already there near the staircase, arms crossed and jaw clenched. Alina stood behind him, silent and pale. Richard stepped forward, raising his voice. "Family, today you will hear the truth." Documents were placed on the long polished table. Police reports, bank transfers, witness statements. Gasps filled the room as reality shattered through decades of lies. "Impossible!" one aunt shouted. "Kidnapping! Who would do such a thing?" Richard looked directly at Frost. "Your mother," he said quietly. The hall fell silent. Frost staggered back, his lips trembling. "No, she wouldn't," Richard cut him off. "She did it to secure your inheritance." Lily covered her mouth in shock. Frost's eyes glistened with tears, confusion and betrayal swallowing him whole. Richard stepped closer. "You were a child, Frost. But you hurt your brother out of jealousy, and that must be atoned for." Frost lowered his head. I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear I didn't know." Blake saw not a rival, but a broken man crushed under the weight of truth. "I forgive you," Blake said softly. "Not for you, for Grace. She deserves peace." For the first time, Frost cried openly. As the tension began to ease, Alina stepped forward shakily. "Blake," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "I'm sorry. I chose excitement over love. I chased something shiny until I lost everything." Blake looked at her, really looked, and felt a strange calm settle over him. "Alina," he said softly, "I hope you find what you're looking for. But don't come back for Grace out of loneliness. She needs stability, not confusion." Tears rolled down Alina's cheeks as she nodded. Richard stepped beside them, lifting Grace into his arms. His voice resonated through the hall. "This child is the future of our family. And Blake has my full support." The relatives murmured softly, many nodding in acceptance now that all truths were exposed. Frost approached Blake slowly, offering a handshake. "If you ever need help at the company," he began. Blake gave a faint smile. "Thank you." Richard placed a hand on both their shoulders. "My sons," he said emotionally, This family is whole again. In the weeks that followed, Blake began working at Dawson Industries, not as an heir, but as a regular employee in the logistics department. He arrived early, stayed late, and learned everything from the ground up. His co-workers initially kept their distance, but soon their skepticism faded. "Blake's the hardest worker here," one supervisor admitted. "He doesn't act entitled." Frost visited often, guiding him through reports with patience. Grace thrived in preschool, her laughter filling Blake's evenings with warmth. Months passed, and Blake climbed step by step, gaining confidence and respect. Richard took him under his wing, teaching him business principles late into the night. One evening, overlooking the glowing city from the balcony, Richard said quietly, "Blake, I'm thinking of stepping down." Blake's eyes widened. "Dad, you've led this company forever." Richard smiled. "Now it needs someone honest. Someone grounded. Someone like you." The announcement stunned the entire company. Blake Dawson appointed as the new CEO of Dawson Industries. Reporters flooded the building, cameras flashing, microphones pushing toward Blake as he entered the lobby. "Mr. Dawson, did you expect this promotion? Do you feel prepared to lead? What changes will you bring to the company?" Blake shielded Grace's preschool drawing folder against his chest, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Frost stood beside him, surprisingly steady, answering questions when Blake couldn't. "My brother earned this," Frost told the reporters. "He worked from the bottom with integrity." Blake glanced at him, quietly grateful. Inside his new office, a large space with glass walls and a panoramic view of the city, Blake felt the weight of everything he had survived. He set a framed photo of Grace on the desk, next to a picture Richard had given him of his biological mother, Anna. "This doesn't change who I am," he whispered. "Not the pain. Not the lessons." Richard entered the room, smiling proudly. "It suits you," he said, looking around. Blake laughed nervously. "I'm still getting used to the carpet." Richard placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Lead with heart. Lead the way you live." Blake took a deep breath and opened his first executive meeting with steady hands. The board watched him with interest as he spoke. "I'm not here to replace history," he said. "I'm here to honor it, and build a better future for every worker in this company." His voice surprised even himself. Firm, clear, confident. After the meeting, Frost clapped him on the back. "Not bad, CEO." Blake smiled weakly. "I'm trying." "Trying," Frost said with a grin, "is what makes you better than most." In that moment, Blake realized he wasn't alone anymore. That Christmas, exactly 1 year after Alina walked out, the Dawson mansion glowed with warmth and laughter. Snowflakes drifted gently outside the tall windows as a massive fireplace crackled, filling the room with golden light. Relatives chatted softly, exchanging gifts and holiday stories. Grace ran around in a red dress embroidered with little snowflakes, giggling as she dodged Richard's playful attempts to scoop her up. Frost stood beside Blake near the Christmas tree. "Crazy year, huh?" he said, handing him a glass of sparkling cider. Blake chuckled. "The craziest, but worth every tear." Frost nodded, sincerity softening his usually sharp features. "I know I made mistakes," he said quietly. "But I'm glad you're here now." Blake looked at him, seeing for the first time not arrogance, but vulnerability. "We both started in the dark," he replied. "We're learning together." Across the room, Richard watched them with pride. "My sons," he murmured to a relative, standing side by side. "I've waited my whole life for this moment." Grace ran to Blake and lifted her arms. "Daddy up." He scooped her into his embrace, spinning her gently. She giggled, touching his cheeks. "Daddy happy?" she asked. Blake kissed her forehead. "So happy, baby girl." As the night grew quieter, Blake stood near the window, watching snow fall over the garden. He whispered to himself, "Life tried to break me, but I rose again." Richard approached, placing a hand on his back. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, he said. But remember, this family is yours now. Your home. Blake exhaled softly, letting the truth sink into his bones. For the first time, peace didn't feel fragile. It felt earned. The following months ushered in a new rhythm for Blake. Each morning he arrived at Dawson Industries before sunrise, reviewing reports, meeting department heads, and listening carefully to employees' concerns. Many workers were surprised at how approachable he was. Some expected arrogance from a new CEO. Instead, Blake visited warehouse floors personally, shaking hands and asking questions. "We're behind on shipments again," one supervisor admitted. "Old systems too slow." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "Then we changed the system," he said. He scheduled meetings with the logistics team, restructuring outdated procedures. Frost often joined him, guiding him through complex financial details. "You're picking this up fast," Frost said one afternoon. Blake smiled. "I've stocked shelves my whole life. Same principles, just bigger shelves." Frost laughed, genuinely amused. Meanwhile, Grace flourished in preschool. She loved painting and often came home with colorful papers that Blake proudly displayed in his office. Teachers praised her bright personality and resilience. "She's a joyful child," they said. "You can tell she feels safe." At home, Richard visited frequently, sharing stories about Blake's mother, Anna, her kindness, her laughter, her dreams. Blake listened intently, trying to fill the void of 35 missing years. Sometimes he cried quietly afterward, overwhelmed by what he never had but grateful for what he gained. One evening as he tucked Grace into bed, she whispered, "Daddy, I like Grandpa Richard. He hugs like you." Blake smiled through misty eyes. "He loves you very much," he told her. After she slept, Blake stepped outside onto the porch, staring at the moonlit snow. His past had been ripped apart, but his future was beginning to blossom, steady, warm, hopeful. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what tomorrow held. Despite the growing stability at home and work, Blake knew challenges were inevitable. Dawson Industries faced competition from rival corporations, and some board members still doubted his sudden rise. During a meeting one morning, Mr. Lawson, a stern senior board member, leaned forward with folded arms. "Mr. Dawson," he said sharply, "many believe your promotion was emotional, not strategic. What makes you qualified to lead a billion-dollar company?" The room fell silent. Blake inhaled slowly. "I come from nothing," he began. "I stocked shelves, pushed carts, worked until my back hurt. I know what it feels like to struggle. I know how important every paycheck is to the people who work here." He paused, meeting their eyes one by one. "Leadership isn't about ego. It's about responsibility. My decisions affect thousands of families. That's why I take this role seriously." Frost gave a faint nod of approval. Mr. Lawson leaned back, studying Blake carefully. "Very well," he murmured. "Continue." After the meeting, Frost approached him with a smirk. "You handled that perfectly." Blake exhaled. "I was terrified." "Good," Frost replied. "Fear keeps a leader honest." Blake learned quickly. He introduced wellness programs, increased worker benefits, and restructured outdated systems. Within months, productivity surged. News outlets praised the company's transformation. New leadership, new vision. Blake Dawson, the CEO nobody expected. Still, Blake remained humble. He drove the same modest car, wore simple suits, and spent evenings helping Grace with art projects. "Daddy, draw a house with me," she often said, handing him crayons. Blake always smiled. "Of course." As he colored beside her, he realized these quiet moments mattered more than any boardroom victory. His heart was learning balance, between success and simplicity, strength and softness. And every day he felt himself growing into the man he was meant to be. One early spring morning, as Blake walked through the lobby, he noticed whispers rippling across the office. Employees glanced at him nervously. Frost approached with a tense expression. "We need to talk," he said. Blake felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. They entered the conference room where Richard waited, brows drawn tightly. "What's going on?" Blake asked. Richard slid a file across the table. "It's Alina." Blake stiffened. He hadn't seen or heard from her in nearly a year. "She's filed a petition," Richard continued. "She wants partial custody of Grace." Blake's breath caught. After abandoning her. After saying she didn't want her. Frost nodded grimly. "Her lawyer claims she was emotionally unstable at the time. They're arguing she's recovered." Blake's jaw tightened. Recovered from what? Leaving her daughter at Christmas. Richard placed a gentle hand on Blake's arm. "Listen, this won't be easy. But you have truth on your side. And you're not alone." Blake inhaled shakily, trying to steady himself. He remembered Grace's first steps, her laughter, and her tiny hands clinging to his neck. He remembered the nights she cried for a mother who never came back. "I won't let her hurt Grace again," Blake whispered. Richard nodded. "Then we fight. Properly. Legally." Frost leaned forward. "We'll get the best attorneys. Alina won't win this." Blake felt fear, anger, and determination swirl inside him. "I'm ready," he said softly. When he picked Grace up from preschool that afternoon, she ran into his arms, giggling. "Daddy, look. I painted a rainbow." Blake smiled, hugging her tightly. "It's beautiful," he whispered. But as he carried her to the car, he silently vowed. No court, no lawyer, no returning guilt would ever take his daughter from him. Grace was his heart, and he would protect her with everything he had. The first custody hearing arrived faster than Blake expected. The courtroom felt cold, the air thick with tension. Blake sat with his attorney, Ms. Carter, a sharp woman with calm eyes and a reputation for fierce advocacy. Across the aisle sat Alina in a fitted gray suit, head held high, her expression unreadable. Her new lawyer whispered instructions, and she nodded slowly. Blake felt anger rising, but Ms. Carter touched his arm. "Stay steady. Judges read emotion more than evidence." When the hearing began, the judge asked Alina to speak. She stood, clasping her hands dramatically. "Your Honor, I deeply regret my actions," she began. "I was under emotional distress. I wasn't thinking clearly when I left. But I'm stable now. Grace deserves a mother's love again." Blake's jaw tightened. He remembered Grace crying for months asking, "Where'd Mama go?" When it was his turn, Blake stood with Grace's drawing folder tucked under his arm. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "my daughter isn't a responsibility to pick up when convenient. She's a human being. She cried for a mother who never called, never visited, never asked about her. I've raised her alone. She finally feels safe." The courtroom fell silent. The judge studied him, eyes softening. "Do you have evidence of abandonment?" Ms. Carter opened a folder. "Your Honor, we have flight records, no contact logs, witness statements, and text messages sent by Ms. Dawson indicating she had no desire to parent." Alina flinched. "Those were taken out of context." "Context?" Blake said, turning toward her. "You said you didn't want Grace." Alina's eyes darted away. The judge raised a hand. "Enough. I will review all evidence carefully. We will reconvene in 2 weeks." As Blake left the courtroom, Richard squeezed his shoulder. "Hold your ground, son. The truth is already working." 2 weeks later, the courtroom was even more crowded. Reporters had caught wind of the case. CO's wife returns to fight for custody. Blake avoided the cameras, shielding Grace's privacy as much as possible. Inside, Alina appeared polished and confident, but Blake could see the tremor in her hands. The judge began by reviewing psychological evaluations. "Ms. Dawson," the judge said, "your evaluation reveals inconsistencies regarding your reasons for leaving. It also notes unresolved emotional instability." Alina stiffened. "I've changed," she insisted. "Grace deserves options." Blake felt a surge of heat in his chest. "She had an option," he said. And you walked away from her. Alina swallowed hard but didn't respond. Ms. Carter rose and presented school records, teacher testimonies, and pediatric reports showing Grace's thriving progress under Blake's care. Grace is emotionally stable, bonded to her father, and has not once asked to return to Ms. Dawson, she stated. Alina's lawyer countered. It's natural for a child to adapt to her environment. But biological connection matters. Blake clenched his fists. Connection isn't DNA, it's presence. The courtroom murmured softly. Then Grace's preschool teacher, Mrs. Hall, took the stand. Grace is happiest on days her father picks her up, she said gently. She talks about him constantly. She rarely mentions her mother. When she does, she seems confused, even frightened. Alina shut her eyes, her shoulders trembling. Ms. Carter handed the judge a final document. Messages from Alina's social media accounts boasting about her new life abroad. The judge sighed deeply, looking between the two parents. I've seen enough for today. I will deliver a verdict next session. As they exited, Grace ran into Blake's arms, laughing about something she saw outside. He held her close, tears burning his eyes. I've got you, he whispered. Daddy's not going anywhere. The final hearing seemed to stretch time itself. Blake entered with Richard and Frost beside him, both offering silent strength. Alina entered alone this time, her confidence visibly cracked. Her eyes were puffy, her breath shaky. When the judge walked in, the courtroom rose. Blake held his breath as the verdict was prepared. This case, the judge began, is not simply about parental rights but about the best interest of a vulnerable child. She shuffled her papers. Ms. Dawson, your history of abandonment cannot be ignored. Your sudden return coincides with financial instability, raising concerns regarding your motivations. Alina swallowed hard, tears starting to fall. Blake Dawson, the judge continued, you have demonstrated consistent, dedicated and nurturing care for Grace Dawson. It is clear that she feels safe, loved, and supported under your guardianship. Blake tightened his grip on the table edge. Then the judge delivered the words that shattered Alina's last remnants of certainty. Full custody of Grace Dawson is granted to Mr. Blake Dawson. Ms. Dawson will have supervised visitation rights once per month. A muffled gasp rippled through the room. Alina sobbed openly, covering her face. Blake felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief wash over him. Not triumph, just peace. Frost leaned in. You did it, he whispered. Blake nodded slowly. As they exited the courtroom, Alina reached out weakly. Blake, please. He paused but didn't turn fully. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered. I lost myself. Blake sighed softly. I hope you find your way, he said. But Grace deserves stability. Don't come back unless you're truly ready to give love, not take it. Alina nodded, crying harder. Blake walked away, feeling the weight of years finally lifting from his heart. Life settled into a warm, gentle rhythm for Blake and Grace after the court battle ended. Blake moved them into a charming two-story home on the edge of the city. Quiet, bright, with a large yard where Grace could run freely. She quickly claimed the space as her kingdom, scattering toys and chalk drawings everywhere. Most evenings were spent with Blake cooking dinner while Grace danced to children's songs, spinning in circles until she fell laughing onto the rug. Richard visited frequently, bringing handmade toys or old family stories Blake never knew. Your mother used to hum while cooking too, Richard said one evening as he watched Grace color. You look like her when you think deeply. Blake smiled softly. I wish she could see Grace. Richard nodded. She sees her in you. Frost often stopped by as well, sometimes with business updates, sometimes simply to play with Grace, who now called him Uncle Frosty, to his great embarrassment. Don't you dare tell anyone at the office, he warned Blake. Blake laughed. She came up with it on her own. Within Dawson Industries, Blake's leadership grew steadier. He introduced new scholarship programs, employee benefits, and revamped safety protocols. Workers trusted him. Investors respected him. But Blake never let it change who he was. He still wore simple clothes, still thanked janitors by name, still bought coffee for receptionists when they looked tired. One night, as he tucked Grace into bed, she wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. "Daddy," she whispered. "Yes, sunshine. We safe now." Blake kissed her forehead. "Always," he whispered. And for the first time in his life, he believed it fully. Spring melted into summer, and with it came new beginnings. Dawson Industries announced a major expansion project, and Blake found himself juggling meetings, paperwork, and construction plans. But he refused to let work overshadow fatherhood. Every afternoon, he picked Grace up from preschool, and they walked hand in hand to a nearby park. She chased butterflies while he sat on the grass, watching the sunlight dance across her hair. One afternoon, as they sat sharing ice cream, Grace suddenly asked, "Daddy, why Mama not live with us?" Blake froze, heart squeezing painfully. He had known this question would come. He took a slow breath. "Your Mama, she went to find her own path," he said softly. "But she loves you in her own way." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "But you here," she said, touching his cheek. Blake swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yes, baby. I'm here. Always." That evening, after Grace fell asleep, Blake stepped onto the porch, staring at the warm glow of street lamps. Richard soon joined him. "She asked about Alina today," Blake said. Richard nodded slowly. "It will happen again. Just answer with honesty and kindness. That's all a child needs." Blake exhaled. "I worry every day about failing her." Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "Blake, you already saved her." Blake closed his eyes, letting the truth settle deep within him. When he opened them again, he saw his future not as a burden but as a gift, one he would protect fiercely. That night, he kissed Grace's forehead and whispered, "You made me strong, little one." By autumn, Blake had transformed Dawson Industries into one of the state's fastest-growing corporations. Business magazines praised him as the CEO with heart. But for Blake, success wasn't measured in numbers. It was measured in the quiet moments he created for Grace. One Friday evening, he surprised her with a backyard picnic. Fairy lights hung from the trees, and a soft blanket lay on the grass. Grace gasped when she saw it. "Daddy, it looks like magic." Blake smiled. "Anything for my girl." They ate sandwiches, blew bubbles, and watched fireflies flicker across the yard. As the sky darkened, Grace climbed into his lap. "Daddy," she whispered. "What? Can we stay like this forever?" Blake hugged her tightly. "If I have a choice, yes." Just then, Richard arrived with hot chocolate, laughing as Grace ran into his arms. Frost joined shortly afterward, carrying a bag of fireworks. "I figured we should make tonight memorable," he said. Blake raised an eyebrow. "Small fireworks?" Frost shrugged. "Define small." Minutes later, bright colors lit up the sky, and Grace squealed with delight. Blake watched her, his chest swelling with gratitude. Later, as the night grew quieter, Richard stood beside Blake. "You know," he said softly, "I used to dream of nights like this. Family, unity, peace." Blake nodded. "Me too." Richard sighed contentedly. "Your mother would be proud of you." Blake felt tears prick his eyes. "I hope so." In that moment, under the glowing sky, surrounded by people who loved him, Blake realized that the deepest wounds had healed. He was no longer the broken man abandoned by his wife. He was a father, a leader, a son restored. And his life, once shattered, had become whole again. As winter returned, so did the memory of the year before. The heartbreak, the betrayal, the loneliness. But this time, Blake met the season with warmth instead of sorrow. The Dawson mansion buzzed with preparations for the annual winter gala. Frost coordinated decorations, Richard managed invitations, and Blake nervously rehearsed a small speech. "You'll be fine," Frost said, adjusting his tie. "Just don't faint." Blake rolled his eyes. "Thanks for the encouragement." When Blake walked into the glittering hall that night, applause erupted. Colleagues, employees, investors, and relatives filled the space with radiant smiles. Blake stepped onto the stage, clearing his throat. "A year ago," he began, "I was working in a supermarket, believing my life had fallen apart. But sometimes, life breaks us so we can rebuild stronger." The room fell silent as he continued. "I stand here today not because of luck, but because of truth. Because family, real family, finds its way back together." He glanced at Richard and Frost, both smiling proudly. "This company's future is bright," he said, "because we lead with integrity and heart." The audience burst into applause. Later, Blake danced with Grace, who twirled in a sparkly white dress. "Daddy, look. I'm a snow princess," she giggled. Blake lifted her high. "The most beautiful one." Across the room, Richard watched them with glistening eyes. Frost nudged him. "You're crying again." Richard huffed. "It's allergies." Frost smirked. "Sure, Dad." Blake saw them and laughed softly. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of belonging, and it fit perfectly. That night, as snow drifted outside the mansion windows, Blake whispered to himself, "I survived the storm, and it led me here." The next morning brought crisp air and quiet streets. Blake brewed hot cocoa while Grace bounced excitedly around the living room. "Daddy, can we go see the big Christmas tree downtown?" Blake chuckled. "Finish your breakfast first." As they prepared to leave, Blake received an unexpected message. It was from Alina. "Blake, can we talk? One last conversation." Blake stared at his phone, unsure. He no longer felt anger, just distance. Richard noticed his expression. "What is it?" Blake hesitated. "Alina wants to meet." Richard studied him carefully. "What do you want?" Blake sighed. "Closure, I guess." He agreed to meet her at a small cafe later that afternoon. Inside, Alina sat at a corner table, her appearance subdued. No makeup, no designer clothes, just a fragile woman carrying the weight of her choices. When Blake approached, she looked up with misty eyes. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. Blake nodded. "What did you want to say?" Alina swallowed hard. "I'm leaving Nebraska. For good. I won't fight anymore. You're a better parent than I ever was." Blake remained silent, letting her speak. "I look at Grace now and realize she deserves stability, love, things I couldn't give." She wiped her tears. "I'm sorry, Blake. Truly." Blake breathed deeply. "I forgive you," he said quietly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean returning to the past." Alina nodded. "I know." She stood slowly. "Tell Grace. I want her to grow happy." Blake nodded again. "I will." As she walked out, Blake felt no bitterness, only relief. He stepped into the cold air and whispered, "Goodbye, Alina." And for the first time, the past stayed behind him. That evening, Blake took Grace downtown to see the towering Christmas tree wrapped in thousands of glowing lights. Snowflakes shimmered in the air like tiny stars. Grace gasped, eyes sparkling. "Daddy, it's so big." Blake lifted her onto his shoulders. "Just like you asked, kiddo." She stretched her hands toward the lights as if trying to catch them. Nearby, a choir sang softly. Families took pictures, couples drank hot cocoa, and laughter floated through the chilly night. Richard soon joined them, bundled in a thick coat. "There's my girl," he exclaimed, lifting Grace into a warm embrace. "Grandpa, look at the lights." Frost appeared moments later with a cup of cocoa for Blake. "You looked cold," he said. Blake smiled. "Thanks, man." They stood together, the four of them, Blake, Grace, Richard, and Frost, watching the immense tree glow against the night sky. "Last year," Blake murmured, "I thought everything was falling apart." Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes things fall apart so better things can fall into place." Grace tugged Blake's sleeve. "Daddy." "Yes. I love our family," she said, wrapping her arms around his neck. Blake felt his throat tighten, but he hugged her tightly. "I love our family too, sweetheart." Frost shoved his hands into his pockets. "You know," he muttered, "we should make this a yearly tradition." Blake chuckled. "Deal." Snow drifted softly, settling on their coats and hair. Blake felt the warmth of belonging settle deep in his chest. No shadows from the past. No threats. Just peace. Christmas morning arrived with golden sunlight peeking through the curtains. Grace ran into Blake's room, jumping onto his bed. "Daddy, Santa came." Blake laughed, pulling her close. "Let's see what he brought." They hurried downstairs where Richard and Frost waited, sipping coffee by the fire. Dozens of gifts lay beneath the tree, wrapped in shiny red and gold paper. Grace squealed with delight, tearing them open one by one. Dolls, books, puzzles, and a tiny wooden music box carved by Richard himself. Frost pretended to be jealous when she hugged Richard first. "What about me?" he pouted. Grace giggled. "You get cookies." Blake watched them with a full heart. After presents, they all sat by the fireplace while snow gently fell outside. Richard placed a hand on Blake's back. "You built a beautiful life, son." Blake shook his head softly. "No, Dad. We built it." Frost smirked. "I helped too, you know." Blake chuckled. "Yes, Uncle Frosty, you helped." They burst into laughter as Frost groaned dramatically. Later, as Grace napped on the couch, Blake stepped outside onto the porch. Snowflakes drifted around him, soft and serene. He breathed in the cold air, feeling gratitude settle deep within him. He whispered into the quiet morning, "I survived betrayal. I survived loss. I survived the truth. And I rose stronger." Behind him, Richard called out, "Blake, breakfast is ready." Blake turned toward the warm glow of the house, toward the family that had found him, and the child who had saved him. He whispered one final thought. This is home." And with a peaceful heart, whole, steady, unbroken, Blake stepped inside to begin the rest of his life.